So what is the ecological hoofprint? One of the big things I try to do with the ecological hoofprint is to make sense of how these productive environments are organized. By these environments, I'm talking about industrial monocultures and industrial livestock operations, and why it is a major problem for the planet, for people, and for animals. So it's a systematic way of thinking about the socio-ecological relations of industrial livestock production. Okay, so the term the ecological hoofprint builds on a very well-established concept in environmental studies that goes back to this book, The Ecological Footprint, by Mathis Wagernagel and William Rees in the 1990s. And with the ecological footprint, one of the things they were trying to do was to make visible the fact that modern industrial societies it's very difficult to understand the environmental implications of our everyday lives. So, we live in ways that we don't often see where things came from, where they go, the resource budgets of our lives or the pollution loads of our lives. And so what they tried to do with the ecological footprint was to say, by consuming and polluting, we are effectively occupying ecological space, very differential ecological space on a world scale. So one of the things they were trying to do was to say, yes, population growth matters, but we also need to recognize uneven consumption on a world scale as a fundamental part of understanding environmental degradation. And again, it's very hard to make sense of all of the environmental implications of our everyday lives in complex modern societies. Where do things come from? Where do they go? How much space do we effectively occupy on Earth? And so they tried to take that sort of big idea and give it some empirical precision. And they've spent a whole lot of time, as have many other scholars, trying to calculate the footprints of modern societies. And one of the big things that the footprint has given us is attention to inequality in environmental degradation, is to say rich countries like Canada, where I'm from in the US, effectively occupy far more environmental space because they consume so many more resources and emit so much bigger pollution loads. And so they basically say, okay, you can add up the various dimensions of consumption, and you can make sense of the differential ecological space different societies occupy. And so what they've really done, I think one of the great contributions of the ecological footprint over the past few decades is to stress that inequality matters in environmental degradation on a world scale. And so, by no means are they saying we don't need to think about population growth, but they're saying we need to add this layer as a fundamental part of thinking about environmental change on a world scale. And another big thing that they've long stressed is that we're sort of running what they describe as an overshoot, that we're consuming far more planet's worth of resources than is sustainable. And so they basically say, we're consuming as many as 4 what they call phantom planets. So this is another one of the contributions of the footprint as a concept. Now, the footprint as a concept has been translated in a range of ways. You may have heard atmospheric footprints or water footprints. These are different ways, again, of calculating differential resource budgets and pollution loads. Probably the atmospheric footprint, I think, is the one that's had the biggest traction. And this is basically a way of visualizing differential greenhouse gas emissions on a world scale, annual greenhouse gas emissions. And this is from a few years ago, but one of the big things it does is look how small Africa shrinks in relation to the United States. There's about 3 times as many people living in Africa as live in the United States. And the 360 million, I should say, is not just the United States population. That's US and Canada, which I've grouped together with similar levels of annual greenhouse gas emissions. A lot of attention has been given to the fact that China has recently passed the US as the biggest annual emitter of greenhouse gases, but China has more than 3 times as many people as the US. So one of the things that the atmospheric footprint has done is to give attention to the very uneven levels of per capita greenhouse gas emissions, which is a fundamental part of understanding climate change, is the hugely differential responsibilities on a world scale. Now, this has also been, the footprint concept has also been applied to the water footprint. There's Arjen Hoekstra, a European scientist, has done a lot to sort of draw attention to the very differential levels of freshwater resource availability and consumption. And he talks about the water that's embedded in different products, or the footprint, differential water footprint in different products. So again, atmospheric and water story. And again, with respect to climate change, it's really important to recognize that the US and Canada together are about 5% of humanity, and for many decades have been well over a fifth of all greenhouse gas emissions on a world scale. So that foundation, the ecological footprint, is part of what I bring to the idea of the ecological hoofprint. And what I try and do is to systematically think through the resource budgets and pollution loads associated with the dietary transformations I've been talking about, the meatification of diets, and the hugely unequal consumption of animal products on a world scale. So far I just talked about the world average, the fact that the average person on Earth is consuming nearly twice as much meat as occurred a few generations ago in 1960. But this is a hugely unequal picture on a world scale. So so this map here is a way of visualizing some of that unevenness. The darkest shades there are the countries that are consuming the most meat per capita in the world, and at the highest level that's about 100 to 140 kilograms of meat, and places like Australia, Argentina, the United States, Canada, and some parts of Western Europe are really at the apex of that meatification. In contrast to most of sub-Saharan Africa, which is under 20 kilograms of meat per person, and most of South Asia, which is under 10 kilograms of meat per person per year. So one of the things I try to do is to systematically think through the resource budgets and pollution loads that underpin the industrial grain oilseed livestock complex, and then think about how this relates to world inequality. And inequality both as a reflection of world inequality, the command of arable land, the command of water, the command of various other resources, and also how it's exacerbating inequality in the sense of its contributions to climate change, which are the impacts of climate change are playing out first and worst in many of the world's poorest countries.